All right, thank you everybody for joining. My name is Mary Rafferty. For those of you who I don't know, I'm the executive director of the Virginia Conservation Network. Very excited to kick off our General Assembly recap. Um, Today, we're gonna go through for about the next 90 minutes or so. I'm gonna kick it off first to Blair from the League of Conservation Voters, who's gonna give us kind of a big picture overview of what happened during session, just from a like what happened overall, not from an environmental perspective, just to set the scene. Following that, I'll give you a couple of the top line numbers from an environmental perspective, and then we will welcome a panel to give more of the policy highlights, lowlights, and just the other things that happened. We will have time for questions. Some of you submitted questions ahead of time, so we are going to start with a couple of those. If you also have questions that pop up while we're having this discussion, feel free to put those into the Q&A. We'll get to as many as we can, and for those that we can't get to, we'll do our best to follow up directly so that we can get your questions answered. But from there, I'm really excited to kick it off. This is, of course, an overview from the Virginia Conservation Network. We are the partnership of the broader environmental community. So this is really intended to give you a broad overview from an environmental perspective. Any one of these panelists and or any one of the advocates that work with us day in and day out could give you a 90-minute presentation just on the issues that they worked on themselves. So we will do our best to cover as much as we can and give you a good big picture overview, but certainly looking forward to follow-up questions as well. So with that, I'm excited to pass it over to Blair to kick us off again with a big picture overview, not necessarily environmental specific, of what happened during the General Assembly over the last couple of months. Blair, take it away.
Can you all see my screen?
Yep.
All right, sorry for the flip back and forth there. So hi, everyone. My name is Blair St. Ledger-Olson, and like Mary said, I'm the Director of Advocacy and Campaigns with the Virginia League of Conservation Voters. And I get the privilege today of trying to tell you what the heck just happened over Q1 of 2025. And as we were talking as a smaller group before we got started, we were saying things like, how do you pick just one? So in these 10 minutes, I'm going to go pretty quick, but I'm going to do the best I can. And trust me, there will be lots of time for questions. You've got great experts here, and I promise I'll miss something. So please don't hesitate at all to reach out, ask a question, and we'll circle back. So let's talk about what we're going to cover. So we'll go over the high-level process of the General Assembly, just a really, I'll do my best Schoolhouse Rock impression, but a really quick overview on timing and procedure. I'm going to go over the lay of the land, so things like chamber breakdowns and some key dynamics and some top line reminders that I really want us to take away from this conversation and be keeping in mind as we gear up for the next session. And then I'll give a high level overview of what just happened yesterday, which was veto session and the budget. And then you'll see my colleagues here kind of go farther down into the weeds of what pieces of environmental policy were impacted. So timeline and process. Again, my best impression of the lovely Schoolhouse Rock song, I'm Just a Bill. So this was an even year, which in Virginia is a short session, pardon me. And actually, for you fellow policy wonks, in Virginia, our short session is actually in the Constitution only supposed to be a month long. We add those extra days to get to 46 days. A lot of times we just say 45, but if you count it, it is 46. We add those extra days to really finish all of the business of the Commonwealth somehow in only 46 days. So a bill starts in its originating chamber. It goes through the subcommittee committee process and it gets to the floor if it's lucky in its originating chamber. That has to happen by crossover, which is February 4th, which if you look at the calendar isn't actually the halfway point, it's the following week. But so we sort of front load the first half of session to get as many bills as we can. And then if your bill is lucky enough to pass by crossover, it starts that process over again in the next chamber. So subcommittees, committees, floor, and again, if your bill is lucky enough, it's enrolled. And then sine die this year was February 22nd. And then 30 days after sine die, the governor has to send down amendments, which so this year was actually Monday, March 24th, I believe, and then reconvene veto session was yesterday, so a week after that. And just for some quick stats, there were almost 2,000 bills introduced this session. So even in a short session, we had a lot of work to do. Now, who were the folks doing that work? So the House and the Senate looked very similar to last year, but there were some key differences. So we had special elections right before session started, and I mean right before. It was Tuesday. And in theory, we started on Wednesday, January 8th. So House leadership was the same as last year. You have a partisan breakdown of 51 Democrats, 49 Republicans. But we did have a brand new delegate who really none of us knew, and his name was JJ Singh, coming from Loudoun County. And then we also, in the Senate, while we had the same Democratic Republican breakdown as last session, the same leadership teams, we had two new senators as well. So Senator Kanan Srinivasan, who some of you likely remember, who was in the House of Delegates for the year prior, and then a new one for all of us after a five-way Republican primary, Senator Cyphers, who replaced Senator John McGuire, who is now in Congress. Now, I talked about that timeline back before, and I said, in theory, session started on Wednesday, January 8th. Session got off to a radically interesting start. And I'm going to talk about some key dynamics that we experienced during session. And I had a really hard time picking which key dynamic to talk about because there were so many. And I started thinking about this component of my talk with you guys today as what's the story of the legislative session? So, as every good story, you have, in theory, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I would like to make a caveat that I was an environmental science major and math minor, and I did not take English classes. So hopefully I got that right. But if I didn't, please let me know later in the comments. I'll make sure to fix my structure at a later date. There's a reason why I'm not in comms. But our beginning, middle, and end were really interesting. And I went into session with an idea of what was going to pass, what wasn't going to pass, what fights were going to be harder than others. And the top line I will say is everything went just about how I expected it was going to go from a what passed, what didn't pass, but everything in the middle was wild and unexpected. So we started off session on January 8th with a water crisis in Richmond being handled by a brand new mayor. And when I say a water crisis, I mean we didn't have any because there was a winter storm, which, by the way, was named Blair. So my name got said a lot for reasons having nothing to do with me as a person, but that was fun when your name starts trending on social media. And there were a lot of political dynamics in that because you have a lot of Republicans coming to Richmond and you have a brand new Democratic mayor in Richmond who can't handle the water crisis. And there were failures within processes that people tried to blame on clean energy, for instance, or battery storage. It was very, very convoluted several days of not having water. So they gavelled in on January 8th, and then everyone went home. And you also couldn't get into the General Assembly building because the fire suppression system, because of the water crisis, broke. So because of that, that meant the Department of Legislative Services, what we call DLS, also couldn't get bills online fast enough. And all of this, not having water, political dynamics, the not having water was a big deal. The snowstorm, all of this really led to a very crunch session. So in reality, we started on January 13th, that Monday. We missed committee hearings. We had to reschedule the State of the Commonwealth. All of that meant even in a short session, we had even less time. I truly learned for the first time just how much that first week, those first slower days, how important those are, both for the process and maybe even my mental health to be able to get that ramp up time. So all these delays meant we had bills not getting through LIS fast enough, so they weren't getting heard. We had extra committee hearings. Even the day before crossover, Senate Finance still had over 100 bills left for review. We had Commerce and Labor meetings that went till almost midnight this year. We had extra hearings on Friday nights and Monday mornings and even Monday nights. It was wild. It's the top line. And that was all doubled down on by the fact that a few weeks into session, we had a new swearing in of now President Donald Trump. We had a new federal administration that really kicked tensions up several dozen notches from a political perspective. And all of that is compounded by the fact that we are headed into a massive election year for Virginia. So I think the amount of times I said the phrase trying to channel some of the Gen Z lingo, again, if I'm getting the lingo wrong, please educate me in the chat. I'm sure I am. But the vibes were bad. We have things called Feelings Week, which is crossover, and it felt like every single day was Feelings Week. All of those items just on their own would have created dynamics that made it difficult to pass bills. When you combine all of them, it gets even worse. So the end story is that 917 bills were passed, but we have special sessions looming because we likely will have to go back to the drawing board on the budget. We have a lot of work to do to respond to what's happening at the federal government. And politics is always going to sort of lead the day this year. It does a lot, but in this year and an election year, it really, really is. And what I meant a few slides ago where I had policy to politics to people is that at the end of the day, all of us are people. And we all make people decisions. We are humans. And so it's really not the policy that drives a lot of this, it's the politics. And so some of those really bold political themes were that this was Governor Glenn Youngkin's last session. It is that election year. We have the House of Delegates, the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the attorney general offices from a statewide perspective, all on the ballot. And there absolutely are, of course, local level races that I am missing. We had power struggles between the House and the Senate of trying, you saw lots of bills the day before crossover died because Senate Finance really took a harsh look at policies and said, we don't have this in our budget. And so they dispatched with a lot of House bills. The House responded on the floor that afternoon by dispatching with a lot of Senate bills, and that trend actually repeated for a couple days. And when I said Feelings Week, that's what I'm talking about. It's not the policy, it's the politics. And so I just wanted to give this overview to say, here are all these dynamics that were outside of a lot of our control in the building. Here are political dynamics that we have to always be aware of. And then when I say other stakeholders here at the end, I also mean that we are all coming to the building with our own priorities, but so are all of the other lobbyists in the building who've been working tirelessly with these legislators. And they're really trying to balance a broad setting sweep of priorities that we don't always come out on top on, but that's the job that we get to try to make us come out on top. So to think about what came out on top, yesterday was veto session, and that includes the budget. So I wanted to just quickly talk high level some numbers, and then we've got some awesome people here who are going to go into the more weeds and specifics on bills. But just so folks are aware, of those almost 2,000 bills that were introduced, 917 passed on sine die on February 22nd. So the governor signed 599 of those. He amended 159 and he vetoed 157. And if, like me, you just did the math and you went, you're 2 bills off, I am aware and I would like to know what happened to them. But I do not have time to dig into that right now. But just in case anyone does the math, I know the math's wrong and I want to find out why. So the vast majority of those legislative amendments, those 159 legislative amendments or bills that had legislative amendments, were rejected. And that was really dispatched with yesterday. And a lot of those actually were on our issues, and those are around energy. So I know Vic is going to talk, excuse me, is going to talk a lot about that. But let's talk also about the budget as we think about this framework of the chaos of the new federal administration. A lot of that drove our conversation. We started this session by saying we have a budget surplus. What do you mean we can't fund XYZ program? And once we saw the dynamics happening in the federal government, and regardless of your political affiliation, Northern Virginia is very much a hub for federal workers. a lot of Virginia's tax revenue, which is where our general funds, the primary source of our general fund comes from, is based on that concentrated income tax revenue. So it had a really big impact on our appropriators on how they were going to spend Virginia's money. So they delivered what would be considered by the vote alone a very bipartisan budget to the governor, and it had a lot of clean water, some land conservation, and Reggie protection priorities in it. It was not 100% by any stretch of the imagination the budget we wanted to see, but it was a budget that overall did what we asked them to do. Maybe not to the level we wanted them to do it, but there was some good in there, particularly on clean water, and Jay can talk more about that. Glenn Youngkin sent down 205 budget amendments. And when you amend the budget to that extreme a level, it really sends a signal to the legislature that he is not interested in the budget that he was sent and that we're starting over. But yesterday, the General Assembly accepted about 30, I believe the final number was 33 of those amendments. And they've sent that amended budget back to Governor Youngkin for consideration. And if you ask me today to look into my crystal ball as to whether or not we will have a budget, I really don't have an answer for you, unfortunately. This is new. This is really new territory for a lot of us. And a lot of us are waiting to see whether or not the governor signs this, whether or not he vetoes it and we're starting over. But he has 30 days to keep us on our toes. So hopefully we'll find out before those 30 days, or in all likelihood, he'll drag it out to the very end, and we'll be back here in Richmond to restart this process and fight for those budget priorities that we did have. So with that, I'm going to thank you guys for your time. We're going to stick around for our Q&A, and I'm going to hand it back to the awesome people here so that they can talk more nitty gritty and we can get to the questions at the end. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Blair. Really appreciate it. Let me flip over my screen real quick so that we can very briefly go over the top line by the numbers for the environmental community. And then I'm going to shift over to asking the questions of our panelists. So if you look at the numbers overall, we at the for the broader environmental community, we tracked about 386 bills. That's about 20% of the total bills that Blair mentioned were overall introduced, just to give you a sense of scale of how many bills we tracked. We then supported 110 bills and opposed 35 bills. This here just shows you kind of how that tracks with other years. So as Blair said, this was a short session. So the best other sessions are the ones here with stars to look at for comparison. But regardless, this is still the most bills we've ever taken positions on as a broader environmental community in a short session, and not too far behind some of the longer sessions that we've recently seen, which is good news because collectively it means that more and more people are getting involved in the process, which we want to see. In terms of how those break down by issues, about 50% of the bills that we took positions on this year were climate and energy bills, followed by water, land use and transportation, good governance, and land conservation. But if you look at the budget, about 2/3 of the budget positions that we took were in land conservation and water. I just flagged this to say a lot of the work that happens in our land and water space really happens and lives within the budget. So Blair just talked about how we actually don't really know the final story of the budget yet. So we'll do some work over the next hour here to tell you what we do know, but we don't kind of have the full final story of the budget because, the governor sent down a budget that was, mostly rejecting what the General Assembly had given him. And then they mostly sent back a rejection of what he sent them in the shortest of ways possible to describe what just happened over the last couple of days. If we look, though, at the final environmental policy results of all of those bills I said we just took a position on, 33 of the bills that Virginia Conservation Network took positions on, which are bills that the broader environmental community took to us to take a position on, those passed. Either the governor has already signed them, or the governor sent down amendments that we supported and then they were supported. So we assume he will sign them, or they don't need his signature because they are a resolution. 64 of the bills that we supported were defeated. Out of the 64, 10 of those were just straight vetoes. So they passed the General Assembly, but then the governor himself vetoed them. The rest of them just didn't make it through the General Assembly session. And out of the bills that we opposed, 32 bills we opposed, and they were all defeated. So the story here is that even in a tough political climate where, there was a really short session with a ton of bills, so it was just really hard with a lot of other dynamics there, we were still able to get some good stuff done that we'll talk about. So I think that's important to know. It's also important to know that for the bad stuff, we were able to kill it, either make it less bad to the point that we didn't mind it anymore, or we are able to just straight up kill the bill. So that I think is important too, to show the strength of the environmental community. Finally, here I have 14 that are awaiting the governor's action. That means that the governor amended these bills. He sent them to the legislature. The legislature yesterday rejected those amendments that we did not support, and so they sent them back to him. We assume most of these will get vetoed. So what I assume is going to happen is that this 64 number is actually going to go up by 14. So I think that, important for y'all to know that that's still out there, but ultimately the storyline is that, 33 of the bills that the broader environmental community worked on passed. We were able to kill everything that we wanted to kill or make it less bad or neutral. And there was still a lot of stuff that ultimately didn't make it through the governor's pen, unfortunately, and we'll need to come back to next year. So with that, let's go and talk to our panelists and hear a little bit more. And my first question, I'm just going to ask a handful of moderated questions, and then we'll go to the questions that you all sent. But top line, like, what was the good stuff that happens? Tell me top line. Kind of a good storyline, something that happened that we should feel really good about. Yeah, Jay, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, I think while there was, as Blair and you both mentioned, there were some major changes in the governor's amendments, there's still a lot for us to be really excited about in water and climate adaptation space. And so a couple of things that come top of mind are Virginia has tried now 2 years in a row to stand up a wetlands policy working group. And last year we were unsuccessful. This year we did get some amendments from the governor, but we could live with them. And so that bill is going to make it across the finish line. This has been it has been very long overdue. Virginia is one of the only states on the Eastern Seaboard that doesn't have a comparable group. We are also one of the most impacted states when it comes to wetlands loss. Our state resilience master plan is projecting that Virginia could lose as much as 88% of our tidal wetlands by 2080 and more than 50% of our non-tidal wetlands. And this just has tremendous impacts on community health, water quality, habitat, and a host of other issues. And they end up saving us a ton of money when it comes to resilience and water quality work, and we have got to find a way to sort of turn the tide on this. Virginia has what is known as a no net loss policy, and yet we are continuing to have net loss every year. And so we're really excited for this group to get up and running and sort of look under the hood and figure out what we need to change here in the state to turn this trend around. Another really big win this year is setting Reggie aside for a minute, because I have no doubt we will talk about it. No matter which budget you look at, the governor's or the conference report that came out of the General Assembly, both made a commitment of $50 million in new money to the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. My position is it's not really new money. You owed us that money from a Reggie auction, but let's take the win and say that we are going to see another influx of significant dollars into Virginia's only community resilience fund, which is desperately needed. And so we are really excited about that. We have communities across the state that have projects backlogged that would help build more resilient communities and help save Virginia significant funds on the backside in disaster recovery. Another really exciting, kind of heartwarming bill this year was what became known as Liam's bill. This was a bill that would expand the eligibility for localities to have what's known as a tree fund. We've been working for many years on different aspects of tree canopy. And one thing we have heard from localities throughout the state is how do we maintain the canopy we have, and what do we do in those instances where we're building in a tight space and we want to make sure that we're holding developers' feet to the fire. And so the tree funds allows localities to be able to accept funds from the developer and take those dollars and use it to put trees in another place where there might be significant need in the city, as well as use those dollars to maintain the canopy, which is a big cost for localities. So it's a big win. We were also so excited to have 9-year-old Liam come into committee this year and testify. And in one instance, he sort of melted everyone's hearts, and it was a unanimous vote. The other chamber had a couple of Scrooges, but all in all, this one kind of sailed afterwards. So there are a couple other good ones, but I think those are top of line for me.
Awesome. Yeah. Vic, how about you?
Hey, everybody. I'm Victoria, the Virginia director with Chesapeake Climate Action Network. From the energy space, I want to talk about the incredible bipartisan support that we saw for distributed generation this year. So a lot of the energy community was focused on the community access to renewable energy, or CARE package, this session. That was a package of 3 bills that were intended to expand our commitment to small-scale clean energy resources, expand access to those resources for Virginians, and ensure we're using those resources to their highest potential, while also guaranteeing, a strong workforce to install and implement those resources. And I'm talking about small-scale clean energy like rooftop battery storage, demand response programs, et cetera. So this is a pretty wonky clean energy space. And I think, a few years ago, pre or just post Virginia Clean Economy Act, those bills probably would have been all but guaranteed a wholly partisan vote count. And that's not where we are now at all. The last few years have been, frankly, tough for the clean energy and climate community. But what we have to show for several years of hard work from advocates, many of whom are here, is educated lawmakers on both sides of the aisle who are genuinely, personally, and politically invested in distributed generation and energy efficiency. And the sort of spoiler alert here is, unfortunately, those bills were either vetoed or amended with the intention to veto. So that bipartisan spirit didn't quite extend to the governor's mansion, but vote counts like 99-0 for the DG Expansion Act, including perennial committee protest vote Todd Gilbert, just show that there's a huge amount of progress that's been made on developing political buy-in on distributed generation over these last couple years. And I expect and hope that we will make progress and get bills like that over the line really easily under a next gubernatorial administration or a different gubernatorial administration.
Thanks, Vic. Mikaela, how about from you?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. So I have a little piece speaking to both bills and budgets. So on the bill front, one of the 33 that did pass was the result of a lot of work over the past 2 years by the Virginia Invasive Plant Coalition, led by Blue Ridge Prism. So it was HB 1941 SB 1166. Numbers don't really matter because it's signed. But essentially what it does is it closes the retail sales knowledge gap around invasive plants. So basically, if you go to a Home Depot or a Lowe's or some other retailer, there will now be labeling requirements identifying invasive plants. It's not a prohibition on the sale of invasive plants, it's just labeling. And this is kind of building off of a lot of effort over the past couple of years, saying, hey, we shouldn't be planting invasive species on state lands, requiring commercial installers to notify landowners before they plant invasives. So this is kind of now looking at the real retail customer base. So the bill was it's going to go into effect in 2027. This was in part from the negotiation between the coalition and the nursery industry of kind of that delayed implementation. So there's time to get all the ducks in a row with what that labeling looks like and how it gets implemented. So that's on the bill front. And then I'm going to cautiously count as a win on the budget front coming out of veto session yesterday. So there were a few, Jay's laughing. I said cautiously. So there was $20 million included in the budget that passed the General Assembly for addressing some of the deferred maintenance backlog in our Virginia State Park system. There was also money for the Department of Wildlife Resources to do some wildlife crossing projects and address the really high rate of wildlife vehicle collisions in Virginia. This was the result of many years of work by Wild Virginia and Wildlands Network trying to get a larger bill passed. And then there was also additional funding included for the BIPOC Historic Preservation Fund, which helps provide a lot of great technical assistance and grant funding to preserve more sort of community historical sites that really traditionally haven't been able to receive funding. So I say cautiously optimistic because the governor vetoed these items and then the House yesterday rejected his choice to take out that funding. So the budget still needs to be signed into law before everything is signed, sealed, delivered. But I'm counting that as a win. One, because there was this funding that made it through in the version that the General Assembly passed, but also it really speaks to legislators paying more attention to some of these issues, like the need for investing in wildlife crossings, like the need to tackle a very significant maintenance backlog in our state parks. And kind of this recognition, one of my favorite quotes was from Delegate Bulova in a committee hearing, and he says, we can no longer be budgeting by emergency to address the state of some of our resources in our system. And we really need to be thinking more long-term about this. So I think this is a good step in that direction of having both the funding and the acknowledgement of the problem that the funding is needed to address.
Thanks, Mikaela. And Trip, round us out with the positive news here.
Trip Pollard with Southern Environmental Law Center. I'll talk just a little bit about in the transportation area. And, you know, as Mary mentioned with her charts on the different bills, you know, in this session, a lot of what we succeeded in doing was stopping very bad things. So that's not really fully a positive. It's more we negated the bad stuff. So, but it's really important, and I did want to stress in particular where we were successful this year in the budget was blocking all of the proposed highway earmarks. And these are really dangerous. One, because almost all the projects that the General Assembly has tended to put in its earmarks are very destructive and lead in and lock into decades of car dependency and pollution. But the other big problem is they use general fund money to fund these highways when we have a significant amount of transportation money. So you're taking money that could go to a lot of other great things that the Maryland community wants to see, as well as education, health, and other purposes, and putting it into highways. So these earmarks are just bad from almost every perspective, and we were able to block all of them this year. Also, quickly on a defend note, won't go into this one, but we were able to defend the Clean Cars bill against a repeal, so it remains on the books despite our disagreements with the current administration. And in terms of positive, a number of things sort of along the lines of what Mikaela said were in the budget. Almost every positive transportation thing in the budget, though, the governor recommended taking out. The General Assembly rejected those amendments yesterday, so we'll see where we are. But among other things, there's some additional money for transit buses, for example. So we'll see how those fare. We won't count those as a win yet, but as others have noted, a lot of things this session, we knew the governor wasn't going to go for them. It was just really important to get them across the finish line in the General Assembly to tee up for the future, even if we don't get it all the way this session. Final thing I'd like to mention in terms of positive bills, a number of positive bills were vetoed. But we do have some that made it fully across the finish line, especially there were some progress on the pedestrian and bicycle safety front. A bill, a lot of local advocates and others on here have been doing work on these for years, strengthening code requirements for drivers, for pedestrians, making it a Class 1 misdemeanor if it results in serious bodily injury or death of a vulnerable road user. And then there was also a bill on the Intelligent Speed Assistance Program, and who that would apply to in terms of drivers having to basically have a check on their ability to drive at reckless speeds in the future. The governor weakened it, but it's still a big win, and the Assembly accepted those amendments yesterday. So some real progress, I think, important progress on the on that front. And again, on other fronts, we made some progress, but the governor X'd out a lot of things, so it tees up many things for next session and the next.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tripp. And we want to start with the wins because, again, I think a storyline here is that there was a lot that got done and a lot of positive progress. And I think it's really important that we as an environmental community, particularly when this work is so hard and we're not getting as far and as we want, as fast as we'd like or need, to really take stock of the fact that we are making progress, albeit sometimes we're just kind of chipping away at the edges sometimes. But some of these are pretty significant, and we wanted to make sure that we flagged them. I also wanted to say, and Tripp and Mikaela and others mentioned this, the reason we bring a handful of folks on this so we can have a little bit of a conversation, but by no means is it just these 5 individuals that we've brought on that moved a lot of these bills. I mean, these are, when VCN says that we took a position on all of these bills, those are individual organizations and advocates that step up and say, hey, I really care about native plants and I want to take a position on this bill, or I really care about pedestrian safety, I want to take a position on this bill. And that is why we've been able to take on so much more. So much of what we're talking about today, while the speakers here are able to give highlights on, these are not the only individuals that have spent time on it. And I just want to take this moment to thank the many who are on the call today who took the lead on a lot of these bills, both on the positive side and those who helped us defeat some of the bad stuff, as Tripp said, because that's what the movement is all about. That's what VCN is all about. It's working together so that we can be as effective as we can as an environmental community. So with that, there certainly were missed opportunities. So why don't we go around in the same order and talk about a couple of the missed opportunities from this past General Assembly session.
Sure. Well, I think the biggest one that comes to mind is the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund. When you think about Chesapeake Bay restoration, there's these 3 big sectors, and it's your agriculture, your wastewater, and then stormwater. And stormwater is the only one that is continuing to grow. It's a growing source of pollution. It is also an expensive source of pollution. And unfortunately, we have been sort of woefully behind in funding stormwater projects. Part of that had to do with the permit cycles that municipalities were going through. So there wasn't as much urgency, but the bottom line is that we do a needs assessment for all of these sectors each year, and Virginia was right on the cusp of pulling off the hat trick. We have fully funded agricultural BMPs for this biennium. We have fully funded our wastewater sector, and we were going into this budget to this session with a needs assessment of $50 million. The House put in 50, the Senate did 40. We got 40. I was willing to look the other way on that 10 million and still consider that the needs assessment, so we could say we did it. We fully funded all of them. But unfortunately, the governor chose to not amend, but actually veto this item. And so it effectively removing any chance of pushback. And again, there's always this outside chance that we're going to see a new budget, and hopefully this issue can be lifted up. But this was a big missed opportunity to have Virginia fully fund all 3 sectors, which is really a critical aspect of the Bay cleanup, and that's that everybody's in it together. So that one's top of line for me. And then there's two quick ones. One is environmental education. Virginia, we had a very modest budget amendment in that would have taken this up by $500,000. Virginia only spends $250,000 statewide right now on environmental education, despite reams of data that show that this leads to critical thinking and STEM skills in kids, and there's all these benefits. But we're only spending about 30 cents a student. And so we'd like to get Virginia on a plan to sort of bring us up to parity with other states. And unfortunately, the governor did amend that. We remain hopeful that that may come out in the final budget. And then I would be remiss at the Bay Foundation if I did not mention this, and that is the stinky fish menhaden. This issue went really far this year. We have been working with legislators for a couple of years now to do a Chesapeake Bay specific study on what is really a foundational species to the ecosystem and to the food web in the Chesapeake Bay. And the House included this study in their budget. Unfortunately, representatives from the reduction fishery came against it very hard in the conference process. And, you're going to hear a lot about this in the coming years, is why I'm slipping it in. But this has really become an untenable situation. Menhaden is one of the least studied fisheries in the Bay, despite playing a critical role. And we have never once done a research project on Chesapeake Bay specific impacts to this fishery. And we are just making management decisions blindly at this point, and it's having ripple effects across bird populations, fish populations, and ecosystem as a whole. So this was really unfortunate because it means we're going to see a delay in that science once again.
Vic, you can just jump right in.
Yeah, so it probably comes as little surprise that in the sort of disappointments arena, have to talk about data center reform. How to meet data center demand while protecting ratepayers and natural resources and meeting our clean energy commitments is a question that we as a community have to answer, but it's also a question that the legislature really has to answer. It's an issue that is going to play a huge role in this next election in a lot of different ways. In 2024, so last session, all data center bills were summarily dismissed because there was an ongoing JLARC report. That's the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee, a state body that studies matters of primarily financial importance for the state. Big report came out, showed a very clear cost impact to ratepayers, and more or less said the demand probably can't be met logistically at this time scale. So advocates came forward with a big package of mostly pretty reasonable policies on transparency, water impacts, ratepayer protections, state oversight, energy efficiency, every way to get at this issue. And none of that got through in any meaningful reform. In terms of what happens from here, something has got to give on this issue. We're already seeing Dominion come forward with a very partial solution to one piece of the puzzle regarding the potential for overbuilding energy resources for the purposes of data center impacts that could later leave. So that's part of this upcoming rate case. That doesn't really in any full way address the ratepayer impact side of this. So it'll be interesting to see how the SEC responds to that proposal. But I think the pressure is just going to continue to build on this issue until the legislature is able to legislate on it. And I'm hopeful that there will be precedent set in states like Georgia and Texas. We're seeing Maryland potentially poised to pass a package that includes a bring your own energy provision. These are states that are also struggling with this issue, but don't quite have the political mandate that Virginia does. And so I'm hopeful that this mounting pressure and action in other states will set the stage for more meaningful reform next session, because it just has to happen, both for us as advocates and for our lawmakers as politicians.
Thanks. Go ahead, Mikaela.
So will come as no surprise for most of you listening, but one of the bigger and frustrating disappointments this year from the land conservation perspective was the Oak Hill project. This was a really exciting, amazing project that was spearheaded by the Conservation Fund to create a new state park. It would protect 1,200 acres in Loudoun County, and also preserve a historic presidential home of James Monroe. It's the last privately owned presidential home, and the family is really interested in conservation and making it into a park so that it's accessible to the public. And what was really fantastic about this project in particular, besides its conservation value, was that it was paid for. It didn't require any investment of state funds. It didn't require appropriations to buy it. Basically, money had already been put in by Loudoun County and the Conservation Fund to not only acquire the property, but also set up a management fund to take care of operating and capital costs. So it's really one of those once in a lifetime opportunities of the size of the property, the immense conservation and historic value of the property, the location, to be able to have a new state park that's so close to one of our kind of big population centers in the state, to enable more people to have kind of that easy outdoor access kind of right in their backyard. So it was very frustrating to see that proposal make it through the House and then not the Senate. And then there was an effort to get it in the budget, and then that didn't work. And then the governor had an amendment to get it back into the budget, and then that still didn't work. And so it's, it's not really clear what the next steps are at this point. But that feels like a big loss. So very disappointing.
Yeah, thanks, Mikaela. Trip.
Yeah, in the transportation area, I would say one of the biggest disappointments is it, started as good news. We were able to pass this year after many years of effort and many, many people's hard work, a bill to create a EV charging funding program for rural areas and underserved areas, places that are just currently and for the foreseeable future being left behind, both by federal charging funding and also where the private sector is tending to invest in charging infrastructure. And there was an accompanying budget item with not nearly enough money, but to start to fund it. The governor vetoed the bill and struck the funding. So that is a huge missed opportunity. Providing infrastructure charging is a critical part of how we begin to address the fact that transportation is the largest source of carbon pollution in Virginia. We've got to use our cars less, but we've also got to make the cars we use cleaner. And the transition to EVs, one of the biggest hurdles consumers say time and again is concern about, will the charging infrastructure be there to get me where I want to go? We've seen a significant increase in the number of chargers in Virginia in recent years, but it is not at all evenly distributed. So it's really important for consumers. It's really important for rural areas, especially for tourism, to attract people to come there. So there's a lot of economic and individual benefits as well as the environmental benefits of this. And it was just incredibly short-sighted for the governor to veto it. We'll be back.
We'll be back. That's the perfect way to wrap up that section of missed opportunities. We will be back. So the last kind of big picture question that I have that we'll go around the horn on is just what didn't fit. So were there any surprises? Were there any unique situations? Were there any any things that happened that you just want to make sure that you flag? Not necessarily the best news we had or the biggest missed opportunities that we had, but just those things that kind of happened that seem important for everybody to know about. So let's see, Jay, let's just keep our order. We'll start with you.
Sure. One thing I really want to, this has already been mentioned, but I think it's important to lift up is both the House and the Senate convened emergency committees in the face of what I think Blair described as chaos on the federal level. I think we're there's a big question mark. And particularly when it comes to conservation and environmental issues, we are always fighting for table scraps on budget items. So if there's going to be an economic downturn, this is something that we should be doubly concerned about for our priorities. So the House has gotten a little more information under its belt so far, and the federal committee just met for the first time, or the Senate committee just met for the first time earlier this week. Their work is going to continue throughout the summer, and a couple interesting dynamics jump out. One, it's really been a while since the Money Committee folks had to look at how many of our state positions are underpinned by federal money. That's something that sort of everybody appreciates, that convenient cognitive dissonance in not understanding that we have so many people that are only working in state agencies because of recurring federal funds. And they like that because they don't have to go put an FTE in the budget. And I think this process is bringing to light some of those structural issues. I'll use DCR as a highlight. A number of our agricultural positions, a number of our floodplain divisions, they get federal money to support those FT or those full-time employees. And the General Assembly may find itself in a position next year where they are funding positions instead of programs, which they are usually pretty loath to do. I think another interesting takeaway from this is it's really going to lay bare how far behind we are on climate adaptation planning. When we think about the projects that the state needs, I talked about the Community Flood Preparedness Fund earlier. That is such a minuscule drop in the bucket in terms of the scale of projects Virginia needs. And we were truly reliant upon hundreds of millions, if not billions, in the next couple of years of dollars in federal investment. The question mark on all of that should make us all extremely nervous. And that's something that these committees are also going to be really digging into. And then selfishly, the last point I will make is that in Virginia, our wastewater and our agriculture dollars come from what's known as the Water Quality Improvement Fund. And that fund is based on how well we do in excess of our projected revenues. And so as we sort of brace to be one of the states that is most highly impacted by potential federal reduction in force, as well as potential reduction in grants, water quality funds are very likely to be directly impacted by that. The genius of that program has been that, when Virginia is doing well, you have no excuse. You have dedicated revenues to water quality, and we love that. The downside is when you have a situation like this, we are going to be the first thing that runs out of cash. And we are really at a pivotal moment in 2025. This is our Bay Agreement deadline. We are in the process of sort of renegotiating what goals will look like. And as I already mentioned, we fully funded two of our major sectors for the last couple of years. But if we go to nothing or a significant reduction, we not only stop making progress, but in a sector like agriculture, you can actually backslide because so many of those practices require annual investment. So we're at a really crucial point here. So I wanted to make sure folks were aware of those committees and that you're paying attention to them because they are going to heavily influence future budget.
Great. Thanks, Jay. And they are meeting regularly, those committees, so people can track those committees that way? Those are the state, House, and Senate committees that were
Yes, they're
created
going to
to
be
deal with the
meeting
federal.
throughout the spring and summer. We have heard the House has a sort of tentative deadline of Labor Day to try and complete their work.
Great. Thank you. That's super helpful. Mikaela, do you want to piggyback on that?
I do. Boy, do I. yes, first, both those committees, you can find information on LIS. The House one is a special committee and the Senate one is a subcommittee of finance that was convened. And also their first meeting was yesterday, and that recording is now up, and it's an interesting presentation from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. But the silver lining that I did kind of want to pull out, because it's something that I've been thinking about with this need that we have, particularly in the environmental community, but also just what legislators are going to be looking at of how does federal funding support agency staff, agency programs. We get a lot of money from the federal government, both through block grants and also through competitive grants that we go after in order to do different projects. But I think it really highlights, and one of the themes I'm hoping to do some education on myself with legislators, is that work in the environmental space is really a marriage of kind of the nonprofit land trusts and environmental groups, state agency partners, and federal partners. It really is, I think, one area of work where you see all of the money and the staff coming from all these places and coming together to make these projects work. And so that's part of what we've been talking about for a long time in the environmental community, is kind of, hey, we need to be stepping up. And part of it's sort of that spend money to make money. It's you need to put in a little bit of money so that you have that match to go after these bigger pots of money, to be able to say, hey, we can be an equal partner at this table, because you do have the expertise and the knowledge and the funding coming from all these places. So that is one thing that I'm excited in some ways to have an opportunity to talk about more and really emphasize, even though the circumstances are less than ideal. But I think it's something that we know very well kind of amongst ourselves in the environmental community, but maybe don't talk about as much of, we always talk about ecosystems. It's also an ecosystem of partnerships to get this work done. So I just wanted to call that out from Jay's remarks. I've also been following this very closely, and it is something to definitely be mindful of. I will also caution, though, as someone that does follow and work on federal policy a little bit, it's going to be a long road before we get any kind of final numbers and cuts. So really what we are going to be confronting in the near term is just an atmosphere of uncertainty, more so than actual kind of hard cut numbers, unless Congress really pulls a fast one and whips out budget resolutions and reconciliations in record time. But that's kind of what we're really facing in the coming months, is a lot of uncertainty about what is going to be hit and how much and when.
Thanks, Mikaela. That's really helpful. Congress is not known for their speediness, so I'm not going to put my money on that one. But uncertainty is a really good thing to flag for everyone. Victoria, I'll kick it over to you.
Sure. So in the sort of world of weird and notable, I want to talk about the dynamics on solar siting reform this past session. So the process by which we approve or don't larger solar farms. Just for a little bit of background, in 2024, Senator Van Valkenburg came forward with a ban the bans bill, which basically said you can't completely ban solar writ large. That was passed by the Senate, including with one Republican vote and including votes from a small handful of Democratic lawmakers that do represent rural localities, before it was then killed in a House subcommittee. There was some involvement from groups in VCN on both sides of that bill, but there was not at that time, I would say, robust coalition engagement. In the aftermath of that bill, everyone sort of rolled up their sleeves and came to the table on the issue. And a lot of stakeholders, we're still in pretty diametrically opposed positions on what the right solution is. So getting to stakeholder consensus or close to it seemed like a pretty tall order. At the beginning of session, there were essentially 3 different takes on the issue. A bill coming out of the Commission on Electric Utility Regulation that was a little more aggressive from a state involvement perspective in approval. A bill that was more geared towards energy planning and involved the state to a lesser extent, and an industry bill on standardizing requirements for solar projects. And what happened this year was basically the opposite of what happened in 2024. The House passed, who had killed the prior bill in 2024, the industry bill. And in fact, that bill was carried by the chair of the committee that killed the bans bill in 2024. And then the Senate got rid of that bill. The stakeholders more or less came together on a close to consensus bill centered on planning, technical resources, and ban the bans. And when I say stakeholders, I'm including the Farm Bureau and my organization testifying in support. And then both chambers killed that bill. So the dynamic from 2024, stakeholders are everywhere on the issue. The Senate can pass a bill and the House can't, turned into stakeholders are pretty close to aligned on a solution. The House can pass a bill on this issue, and the Senate, who does not have an election this year, cannot. So it's just a very interesting sort of reversal of some of the dynamics that we saw on a big issue in the prior year.
Mary, can I find a couple other items there? I think, you know, this was just such an interesting topic this year, but some other items that jumped out is we really saw sort of a broader coalition of people come forward on this issue than we had in the past. It had been really a niche conversation. And you know, this year standing in committee and looking down the line at everyone from, you know, a nursery association to the farmers to local government and energy and water groups and land conservation groups. It was and half of the industry groups, while the other half was on the other side. I think one of the things that really stood out to me, well, was two-part. Is one, conversations around siting this year were really focused on solar, but what's clear looking into the future is there's going to be a continued need to have a conversation around sustainable energy siting writ large, whether that be battery storage, whether that be the potential for nukes. These questions are going to keep coming up, and at this point there's really just a bigger coalition of interested parties that will be involved. And I thought the other thing that was really fascinating was that industry was not of a single voice. That we are, you know, I think for so long in Virginia we were chasing this goal of like rapid renewable energy deployment that for many of us, it never occurred that when we got there, there would be a lot of different shapes and sizes that didn't necessarily have the same outcome in mind. And that came into stark relief this year, as we saw play out in a lot of committees. So on this, I would say, folks, definitely stay tuned. I'm now aware of 6 different groups working on solutions and growing by the day. So we'll, I am sure we'll be revisiting it next year again.
Yeah, thanks. And before we kind of kick it to Trip, if you've been following along, both Victoria and Jay spent a significant portion of their time over the last year, and certainly during session, trying to figure out how do we at scale get placed the solar that is needed in a way that best protects our natural resources. As Vic said, we got pretty close, you know, to consensus there, and didn't get it over the finish line. But again, as Jay said, I think this is a much bigger story of how we do this and how we make sure to bring our local communities along in this pretty significant energy transition that we're seeing. And again, just to tie the loop up even more, as Victoria said, one of the biggest missed opportunities that we had this year was around data center reform, and we kind of can't not acknowledge the fact that there's pretty significant energy demand caused by this industry. So we need to make sure that that industry is also at the table of figuring out how we're going to get to zero carbon electricity kind of in the face of increased demand in a way that's affordable as well. So that's a to be continued for sure. Trip, how about you? Anything surprising or unexpected, or just, you know, worth kind of mentioning that's kind of outside of the pros and cons?
Yeah, so just real big picture. After we had a massive transportation overhaul bill in 2020, and ever since then, everyone's been saying, well, we're going to have a quieter transportation session in the General Assembly. This session, it finally happened after 4 years of it never arriving. There was plenty happening, but comparatively, there were a lot fewer bills on transportation than there have been in probably at least 10 years. But while not unexpected, there were a lot more land use bills. So the transportation and land use kind of wing of the work in the environmental community sort of balanced out a little bit. One thing you both, several people have touched on, two huge topics. Heard about more from the energy perspective, but also our massive land use issues are data centers and solar siting. So, those also have a lot of zoning and land use implications and as well. And just one other area that got a lot hotter this year on land use was affordable housing and the links between housing and land use and zoning policies. A lot of that didn't, at the end of the day, at the end of the session, result in bills that passed, but a lot of good ideas were surfaced. I think some of the concepts need some more work, and they will get that. But I think it's really important that housing and land use sort of debate has come back to the General Assembly for the first time actually in quite a while. So I think that's kind of another big picture issue I just wanted to flag. We could spend a whole hour and a half just talking about housing and land use, but I think that those are all three of those: data centers, solar siting, and as Jay says, other energy siting and affordable housing are all things that we'll be hearing a lot about next session.
Yeah, thanks, Trip. And it's interesting. I think we tend to think about our land use work kind of in its own silo, and just like any of our issues, none of this work lives within a silo. But I think our land use work in particular, those of us who got kind of really deep in the weeds on the solar issue last year realized that much of what we were really talking about, as Trip just said, was land use. And certainly the folks that have been working on data centers are feeling the same, and housing, et cetera. So, we hope to, as a community, do some deeper dives on land use overall to just make sure we all understand the kind of history, and basically try and pump Trip's brain for all we can get out of it on the background of zoning, comp plans, and planning. So we have a couple more minutes, and there's some other questions that were asked, and so I'm going to ask some more specific questions, but certainly if folks have them, we've been answering them as they've been coming in through the chat as well. But I guess, Vic, this one I think starts with you, and Blair, you're welcome if you're there too to come off screen and help answer this as well. But kind of, given all of the bills this session and last session, it seems like the storyline is basically that we're killing most of the bills that are coming against the Clean Economy Act. But are we still on pace to get to zero carbon by 2050, as is laid out by the Virginia Clean Economy Act, that kind of signature bill that was passed in 2020 for clean energy? And just then, as a follow-up, what is the status of RGGI and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative? Are we in RGGI? Are we not in RGGI? What's happening with RGGI? So those I'm going to kind of put together as one question. And maybe, Vic, we'll start with you, and Blair, if you wanted to add anything to that as well.
Yeah, in terms of where are we on VCA implementation, are we still on track? The short answer is more or less yes. When I'm thinking about the VCA, there's a couple pieces here. One are the clean energy build targets. And so that's really intended to jumpstart our clean energy industry. But the meat of the VCA is our renewable portfolio standard, which is what holds us accountable for decarbonizing on a year-by-year basis until we get to zero carbon. And we are on track for our RPS obligations, particularly any small, bottom of the envelope math issues are going to be resolved when the first batch of offshore wind comes online, which is happening on schedule, knock on wood, right now. So the short answer is yes. The slightly more complicated answer is we do have huge demand issues that we're going to have to solve, and we know that our utilities are currently not planning to meet that increased demand with zero carbon resources, which is very obviously going to make VCA targets not attainable. So it's up to us as advocates to hold their feet to the fire and put forward zero carbon plans that are able to meet that load while also addressing the demand side of it. And we have those plans. We have some of those policy solutions. But again, short answer, yes. Long answer, more work to do, particularly on holding Dominion accountable. And maybe I'll let Blair jump in, and I'll let Jay, if he's here, talk about the RGGI side of things.
Yeah, sure. Mary, I think it was you who told me that almost 50% or almost half of all the bills that we took positions on this session within VCN were about energy, whether or not that was offense or defense. Every session I say, well, defense is going to get easier, right? And then it doesn't. So, you saw 30 bills on VCEA or Reggie or clean cars that, or kind of on the fringes of just maybe it wasn't an attack on the VCA, but it was an attack on clean energy or clean energy future that we had to kill. And some of them were very easy to kill. Some were, when I started at the top of the call, I said everything that died that I thought was going to die. Everything that I thought was going to pass. But the in between was way harder than it should have been. And that was the trend that I felt this session. Bills that really we did not need to have a 45-minute debate over in committee. We had to have a 45-minute debate over in committee to kill. And so that shows two things. One, that our lawmakers are very much paying attention to this issue, that they see it as a political issue for them to either win or lose on. And to Vic's earlier point, we have thresholds in the VCA that are codified. One of them in particular is 40% net zero, 40% zero carbon by 2030. That includes our nuclear portfolio. We are in theory on trend to hit that. But in 2020, we also set RPS numbers by year, essentially by tranches of years that were based on our 2019 demand. And those numbers probably need to be recalculated in the coming years, regardless of how much of a win we have on data centers. Demand, they're not going to go away. We all obviously want them to have a sustainable development plan, but even under a sustainable development plan, that means that we have to address their demand. And so we've got some reforming of the VCA to do to ensure that we hit those clean energy goals. We tried some this year. Youngkin nastily amended every last one of them. So unfortunately, those aren't going anywhere, but we know where we're starting from for next year. And Jay, you want to talk about the highs and the lows of our Reggie experience this session?
No, but I will. I think bottom line for folks is if you're waiting for resolution on Reggie, you're still going to be in a waiting pattern for a while. What we saw this year was a little bit of gamesmanship between the budgets, where people were making statements on whether or not the lawsuit and the governor's challenge to Reggie was valid via budget amendment, and then the governor shooting back to reassert what he thinks is his authority to remove Virginia from Reggie, despite very clear language in the law to the contrary. So where we ultimately ended, I mentioned that there were, in both budgets, we still saw money going into the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. Unfortunately, we also saw money not going into the energy efficiency side. And that was not just a governor decision. So, we've unfortunately seen this happen in the General Assembly before, where they're sort of, while the General Assembly has made it clear they support the statutory language for Reggie and do not think the governor has authority to take us out of Reggie, they also seem to be okay looking the other way when it came to taking dollars away from energy efficiency and applying it to other items. So I think that was sort of an unfortunate trend we saw continued in both the governor's and the General Assembly budget. The governor had 5 Reggie-related budget amendments. Some of them contradicted one another, but the bottom line is that for the remainder of this administration, we're very unlikely to re-enter into Reggie, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. The question will likely be tied up in litigation, at least through the end. And as we go into a new administration, that will lead to our next chapter. In one instance, we may rejoin administratively almost overnight. In another instance, we may continue the litigating fight in the courts. And so for the foreseeable future, Virginia is going to be tied to those general fund dollars that we applied to CFPF, and unfortunately for the state, continuing to fall behind in energy efficiency and resilience upgrades.
Thanks, Jay. I appreciate that. Mikaela, I did not swing back around to you for your surprise moment, but the other question I had also goes to you. So maybe you can tie these up into one nice little bow. There was a lot of chatter this year about something called the Virginia Great Outdoors Act. And I was wondering if you could let us know a little bit more about what that is and where that's headed.
Happy to. So the Virginia's Great Outdoors Act is a bill that is near and dear to my heart. Essentially what it does is it would establish dedicated funding for a whole variety of programs, as well as state agency land acquisitions and investments in state parks and trails. So basically, instead of all these programs having kind of variable funding year to year based off of the mood of the General Assembly, it kind of sets a very steady baseline because there is a piece of revenue coming in that goes directly into a pot that goes to these dedicated projects and programs. And what happened this year is we actually had a committee hearing in front of the Natural Resources Subcommittee of House Appropriations. And that was kind of my unique moment, was that day was very special. It was also the VCN Conservation Lobby Day. And my favorite moment was actually in one of the meetings with legislators that we were in. There were also some kids from high school that I'm blanking on the name of that were there, and they'd all picked different issues out of the ones that were highlighted in the folder. And there was a kid in front of me that started talking about the importance of Virginia's Great Outdoors Act. And I was like, that's my bill. Like, that's what I've been working on. So that was pretty fun. And walking around the building and hearing it on a bunch of coming out of people's mouths. But also in that committee hearing, we had a line almost out the door. We had to swing around the back of the room, and that was really special and fantastic to see, because obviously it's a lot of the traditional kind of environmental groups, Nature Conservancy, that's where I'm representing, but also we had Virginia Restaurant, Lodging, and Travel Association. There was a woman from the National Organization of Women, their Virginia chapter, that spoke up that I did not know. She was in the room and she was moved by the testimony and joined the line. So that was very exciting to see that. It's one thing to have all the polling about the high support for conservation and investing in our outdoors, but it's another thing to see it in person and hear people around you talking about it when it's something that lives mostly on your hard drive. So that was a very special moment for me, but also heartening to see, because we will be coming back every year until that bill gets passed. So
there's that line again. We will be back. We will be back. Thanks, Mikaela. So in our last few minutes here, this is kind of like a big question that I want all of our panelists to answer from their perspective, but there's a lot happening this year. There is another big election year coming up. Many of us on this call are 501c3 organizations. It means we do not endorse in elections one way or the other, including VCN, but it doesn't mean that we don't encourage people to vote. It doesn't mean that we don't encourage people to continue to talk to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, or candidates who are running on both sides of the aisle. Those things are permissible. And just a quick, we do a session every year for partners of VCN to learn about what you can and can't do during an election season. So keep an eye out for that, because we will certainly do that this year. But kind of within the context of, okay, session just ended, it's April 3rd. We have a very short session, so session's not going to start again until January. Like, knowing that there's an election happening, knowing that there's all this time in which there is nothing, they're not actively in session, although as Mikaela and Jay said, maybe they will be if there's a special session related to what's happening at the federal level. But let's just put that aside by now. What should folks do? How do folks stay engaged in the off season? I'm sure many people on this call participated in the legislative preview, participated in lobby day, have been following along. Are there things that folks should be doing kind of over the next, 9 to 10 months between now and next January? What would you recommend? And we can kind of do this popcorn style. So whoever wants to kind of like come off mute, we'll kind of give everybody a chance to answer that question.
Sure, I'll start really quickly and just say, from a completely 501c3 perspective, I am a 501c4, so I will just preface everything I'm saying C3. The most important thing that candidates on both sides of the aisle, whether they're new or they're incumbents, are looking at, and oh God, how frozen was I?
The most important thing is that's what we got.
Amazing. I hate my internet. I blame data centers. The most important thing is what their constituents are talking about. So what is in the media? What is in the neighborhood Facebook group? What is in, so social media from the media perspective, as well as op-eds, LTEs, what is popping up as the dialogue? And so if you aren't engaging electorally, you don't want to talk to candidates. Everyone has their role to play, right? Some people are going to do 501c3 candidate education. Some people are going to start lobbying early for their 2026 priorities. But if you are looking for a way that you as an individual can really start to uplift what you want to see a new administration, Democrat or Republican, prioritize, is talking about these issues and really making a drumbeat of these issues in your community, showing up to community events. You might feel like you're a broken record. Pretend you've got that megaphone and don't let the narrative stop on your priorities. That's really the best way to break through the noise.
Thanks, Blair. Good advice. Other folks want to add things to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Blair is hitting the main item on the head there. It's, these are folks that are running to represent their community. They need to know that their community feels passionately about it. But I will also say, looking around the horn here, we work on a lot of issues that are deeply technical, and the politics, maybe I'm just becoming an old curmudgeon, but they are becoming more and more superficial over the years. And so it is really hard for me to look across the General Assembly sometimes and find that member that has nerded out and is an expert in stormwater or, really understands local planning. And it's just kind of the nature of how politics has been evolving. It's much more public facing, and there's less technical expertise in the building. And to that point, this is the time when you can schedule the long form meetings. And if you want someone to understand elk migration or stinky fish in the bay or what the heck, the virtual power plants are, which is still unclear to me, you need to sit down with them in this off season and take the time to work with them, because you have to build up champions who can go into the committee and translate this into 30-second chunks to their fellow committee members. So I really think the spring and the summer is for education. Invite them to lunch, try and go to their events and cultivate that relationship, but use it to make sure that, as Blair said, we almost had 2,000 bills. The idea that you're going to get them up to speed on a technical question in a 45-day session with 2,000 bills is laughable. And so now is when you have to take the opportunity to help round them out on these issues.
I'm going to piggyback off of that to say, really think comprehensively about rounding folks out. There's the technical, but there is quite honestly also a level of just basic education of, what is conservation and why is it important? What is an easement and how does it work? What is, what counts as stormwater and why do we have more of it? Like, I think also those questions, it's a mix. It depends on kind of the member and if they're brand new or if they've worked on this a little bit. There's varying levels of education, but I think echoing what Blair said about, on the one hand, expressing, as a individual constituent, as a group of constituents, here is what we want, here is what we need, here is what we're seeing in our community that we want you to address. And then also that kind of explaining the why. There's the personal side of the why, but then also just the very basic education of like, here's how this actually works. All the things that take more than 5 minutes to explain. So really just echoing both of those things, but yeah, in addition to the nitty-gritty technical details, better to be safe than sorry and start at the bottom level and kind of build the knowledge on top of that instead of coming in with just the technical and assuming that they have that kind of ground knowledge.
100%.
Yeah, I agree with most of what's been said. Now is the time for that sort of deeper relationship building. And I think folks should just understand as we start to get into the summer and the late fall, I wouldn't be scheduling big events trying to get lawmakers to come to your thing because they are slammed. Whether or not they have an election themselves, they're going to be involved in some way in the gubernatorial and the House races. So it's really, if you want to continue that drumbeat of education, you're going to need to come to them, and it doesn't have to be election events. They're going to be doing other forums that are not associated with their election officially. But you're going to have to make a point to go to them as opposed to having a big thing where you're inviting 40 or 50 lawmakers to learn about X or Y event.
So lots of good suggestions. In the interest of time, I'll just stress, make yourself heard. Now's the time. Make yourself heard. Let people know you care about it. And that's the number one recommendation.
Well, thanks, Trip. And I'm going to take off my moderator hat and put my panelist hat on just for a second because I really can't help myself, but I did wait until the last 3 minutes of the presentation. But as a grassroots organizer, like now is a time to get people engaged in your issues. So, you know, whether you are a board member of an organization, whether you yourself are a volunteer of an organization, you might be an executive director of an organization, get people involved in the work. I personally am, I know my neighbors are, my friends are, my family is feeling like the issues that we are working on are really tough. And so remind everybody that we got some stuff done this year. That's where we started. Know that it is all doable and find some times to be with people and build community with one another. That might mean going to an elected officials event, but it might also mean doing a tree planting. It might also mean doing a green drinks event at a brewery. It might just mean getting together with folks or doing a book reading or any of the variety of things that can happen. Use the next few months, use the next 9 months to build community because we need a lot of people to show up when the moment is ripe during the General Assembly session. But I think now more than ever, we kind of need each other to know that we're going to be able to make some big progress, but we're going to make it as a group. So find ways to get people together through your organization, through your personal networks, and educate them about the issues that you care about, both from a policy perspective, but also just doing fun things. So that's my big tip. I really want to just appreciate everybody again who was able to be here as a panelist. So thank you, Mikaela, Blair, Victoria, Trip, and Jay for joining us as panelists. Thank you to Jaime, Brittany, and Nicole, who have been off camera, but who are the whole reason that this thing works. So thank you for the logistics of making this possible. And thank you to those of you who not only attended and joined today, but to the really hundreds of advocates that are the reason that we were able to make progress this year. VCN doesn't do it ourselves. We do it as a community and as a network. So thank you all so much for everything that you've done.
And thank you to
1:30.
Mary. Thank you to Mary.
We'll see y'all soon. Thank you all so much for the hard work.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.